November 20th, 1943. 0544 hours. Batio Island, Tarawa Atoll. Private First Class. Robert Sherrod crouched behind a disabled Amtrak on Red Beach 3, watching Marines die in waist-deep water. Japanese machine guns from reinforced bunkers cut through the second wave like a harvesting machine. 76 men from his company had made it to the seawall. 147 had left the ship. The water between the reef and shore had turned pink. Before we continue with what happened on Tarawa, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Batio Island, where the 2nd Marine Division was learning why the Japanese had never feared any enemy. Until now. What Robert Sherrod witnessed that morning wasn't just another beach landing. It was the crystallization of something the Imperial Japanese Army had been reporting to Tokyo with increasing alarm since Guadalcanal. American Marines didn't fight like other soldiers. They didn't retreat. They didn't surrender. And most terrifying of all, they didn't stop. But this reputation didn't emerge from nowhere. It was forged through a specific evolution of tactics, training, and a psychology of warfare that transformed ordinary American boys into something the Japanese military had no frame of reference for understanding. The fear began with a single patrol on Guadalcanal 16 months earlier, August 21st, 1942. 02:30 hours. Southern Perimeter, Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Corporal Mitchell Page, 24 years old, from Charleroi, Pennsylvania, stood his post at machine gun position number 3. He'd been a coal miner before the war, working 12-hour shifts in darkness. The jungle night didn't bother him. What bothered him was the sound. At first, it seemed like wind through the kunai grass. Then Page realized that wasn't wind. That was breathing. Hundreds of men, all breathing in unison, moving through the darkness toward his position. The Japanese Sendai Division was about to teach the Americans what real soldiers looked like. Page's best friend, Corporal Ralph Briggs from Mobile, Alabama, manned the gun to his left. They'd met during boot camp at Parris Island. Briggs wanted to open a fishing charter service after the war down in the Gulf. He'd already picked out the boat, a 32-foot Chris craft he'd seen in a magazine. He'd taped the picture inside his helmet. "Mitch," Briggs whispered across the 20 yards between positions. "You hearing this?" Page heard it. The breathing had become chanting, low, rhythmic. The Japanese were working themselves into a frenzy, preparing for what their doctrine called a spirit attack, a massed bayonet charge designed to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer momentum and willingness to die. It had worked against the British in Malaya. It had worked against the Dutch in the East Indies. It had worked against the Chinese for 5 years. Japanese infantry training emphasized that the warrior spirit, Yamato Damashi, would always defeat material advantage. A man willing to die would always defeat a man who wanted to live. At 02:47 hours, 3,000 Japanese soldiers charged Page's position. What happened next would begin to change Japanese tactical doctrine across the entire Pacific theater. The first wave hit Page's machine gun field of fire at 15 yards. He'd positioned his Browning M1917 with interlocking lanes with Briggs's gun, exactly as taught at Camp Elliott. The two Marines opened fire simultaneously, creating a crossfire that cut through the assault like scissors through silk. But the Japanese didn't stop. They didn't take cover. They didn't retreat. They kept coming, climbing over their own dead, bayonets fixed, screaming. Page had fired the Browning for 17 minutes straight when he heard Briggs's gun go silent. "Ralph!" he shouted. Nothing. The Japanese had broken through to Briggs's position. Page could hear the struggle, the wet sounds of bayonets finding flesh, Briggs screaming, then silence. Page was now alone, with the entire Japanese assault funneling toward the gap where Briggs had been. Any other soldier would have retreated. Every tactical manual said that a lone machine gunner against battalion-strength infantry should fall back, consolidate, preserve the weapon. Mitchell Page picked up his machine gun, a 47-pound weapon designed to fire from a tripod mount, and charged into the Japanese line. He held the Browning at his hip, firing on the move, the barrel glowing red-hot in the darkness. Japanese soldiers, trained to expect enemies to retreat or surrender when overwhelmed, froze in confusion. For 3 seconds, nobody fired at Page. Those 3 seconds allowed him to reach Briggs's position and set up a new firing line. The Japanese charged again. Page fired until the barrel began to warp from heat. He switched to his pistol. When that ran dry, he grabbed a rifle from a dead Marine. When that jammed, he picked up Japanese weapons and used those. The assault broke at 042 hours, not because the Japanese had achieved their objective, not because they had been ordered to withdraw. They broke because the men in the front ranks refused to continue advancing toward the position where Corporal Page had killed 111 of them in 90 minutes. This had never happened before in Japanese military experience. Individual soldiers displaying courage, yes. Defensive positions holding, certainly, but a lone machine gunner, surrounded, picking up his weapon and attacking into a battalion-strength assault. The after-action report filed by the Sendai Division commander included a phrase that would be repeated in Japanese military assessments for the rest of the war. Enemy displays irrational commitment to forward positions. Between August 1942 and February 1943, this phrase appeared in 73 different Japanese intelligence reports, the Imperial General Staff in Tokyo noticed. They began to analyze why their infantry tactics, proven successful against every opponent for 5 years, were failing catastrophically against American Marines. The answer terrified them. Marine Corps, Base Quantico, Virginia. 18 months before Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson sat in a stuffy office, writing a training manual that would accidentally create the most feared light infantry force in the Pacific War. Carlson had spent 2 years in China, observing Mao's communist guerrillas fight the Japanese. He'd seen something that contradicted everything in American military doctrine. Small units, led by junior officers, making independent tactical decisions without waiting for orders from headquarters. The Chinese called it ethical indoctrination. Carlson called it something simpler: every Marine a leader. The Corps initially rejected his ideas. American military tradition emphasized top-down command. Privates didn't make tactical decisions. Corporals didn't adjust fire plans. Junior officers followed orders. Period. But Carlson had one advantage. The Marine Corps was desperate. In 1940, the entire United States Marine Corps numbered 28,000 men. To fight Japan's empire, they'd need to expand to 485,000. That meant 94% of Marines would be raw recruits, most with no military experience. Traditional training couldn't scale that fast. Carlson's method could. The innovation was simple but radical. Train every Marine as if he might need to lead. Teach privates to read maps. Teach corporals to call artillery. Teach every man to make life and death decisions in combat without orders. Most revolutionary of all, teach them that tactical withdrawal was sometimes necessary, but psychological surrender was never acceptable. The mission comes first. Your buddies come second. You come last. Marine boot camp at Paris Island became legendary for its brutality. But the brutality had a specific purpose: break down every recruit's civilian instinct for self-preservation, then rebuild it with the group's survival as the primary objective. Drill instructors created a culture where the worst insult wasn't coward, it was, you let your unit down. Marines who failed could be court-martialed. Marines who abandoned wounded buddies faced something worse: exile from the only family that mattered. This created soldiers the Japanese had no psychological framework for understanding. Japanese military culture emphasized obedience to hierarchy and willing sacrifice for the emperor. But it also assumed enemies shared a rational calculation. When the cost exceeds the benefit, you retreat or surrender. Europeans did this, Chinese did this, even the fanatical warrior cultures of Southeast Asia did this. American Marines didn't. At Guadalcanal, Marine units surrounded and cut off from supply fought for days without food, often without water rather than surrender. At Tarawa, Marines crossed 400 yards of chest-deep water under continuous machine gun fire, because their orders were to take the beach, and orders meant something absolute. The Japanese called it marine disease, marine bio. Intelligence reports described it as a psychological condition that made Americans incapable of rational military decision-making. But it wasn't a disease, it was a doctrine, and it was about to get worse. January 14, 1943, Camp Pendleton, California. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller stood on a firing range, watching his battalion practice the new doctrine that would become standard across the Marine Corps: aggressive patrolling. Most armies use patrols for reconnaissance. Go out, observe enemy positions, report back. Puller's innovation was simpler. Find the enemy, fix them in place, kill them. Every patrol was a raid, every contact was an assault. The Japanese military had never encountered this approach. In their experience, small units tried to avoid contact unless they had numerical superiority. Puller's Marines sought contact even when outnumbered. At Cape Gloucester in December 1943, a Marine patrol of 12 men encountered a Japanese company of 147. The Japanese commander, following doctrine, prepared to surround and destroy the smaller force. The Marine sergeant, following Puller's training, immediately attacked. The Japanese force scattered. 17 Japanese soldiers died in the first 30 seconds. The Marines suffered 2 wounded. The after-action report from the Japanese regiment commander described the engagement as incomprehensible enemy behavior, suggesting mass psychological impairment. But there was nothing impaired about it. The psychology was deliberate. Puller had observed that the Japanese military made a fatal assumption that American forces, like European colonial forces, had low tolerance for casualties. The Japanese believed Americans would trade space for lives, that they'd retreat rather than accept heavy losses. Puller taught his Marines to do the opposite: trade lives for tactical advantage, not wastefully, not stupidly, but with absolute commitment. If taking a position required a frontal assault across open ground, you made the assault. If holding a position meant staying while surrounded, you stayed. This wasn't blind courage, it was calculated psychology. Puller understood that the side willing to accept higher casualties almost always won small unit engagements, because the enemy's morale broke first. Japanese soldiers were trained to accept death in service to the emperor, but they weren't trained to cope with enemies who not only accepted death, but used it as a weapon. At Peleliu, a Marine platoon defending a position called Bloody Nose Ridge held against repeated Japanese counterattacks for 3 days. The Marines suffered 83% casualties. 41 men became 11, but they held. The Japanese regimental commander wrote in his diary, "The Americans do not fight to win. They fight to exhaust us. They trade bodies like merchants. This is not warfare. This is murder by ledger." He was almost right. It was murder by ledger, but the ledger showed something he didn't want to admit. The Marines were winning the exchange. What made this sustainable, what prevented it from being simple suicide, was the third element of Marine doctrine: combined arms integration at the squad level. Every other military force in World War II called artillery, air support or naval gunfire, through battalion or regimental headquarters. Request went up the chain. Permission came down. Fire mission launched. Minimum time, 20 to 30 minutes. Marine doctrine pushed fire support control down to company level, sometimes platoon level. A Marine lieutenant with a radio could request naval gunfire within 4 minutes. A Marine forward observer could call airstrikes directly. This created a tactical reality the Japanese couldn't counter. Marine infantry didn't need numerical superiority, because every Marine squad could bring the firepower of a battalion. At Saipan, a Marine company of 147 men, surrounded by a Japanese regiment of 2,000, held for 16 hours by continuously calling in naval gunfire. The USS Tennessee, 8 miles offshore, fired 514-inch shells in direct support. The Japanese regimental commander estimated he was fighting at minimum 1 full American division. He was fighting 1 company, with a radio. The psychological impact on Japanese soldiers was devastating. Their training emphasized that courage and warrior spirit would overcome material disadvantage. But how do you overcome destroyer shells landing 50 yards from your position every 90 seconds for 16 hours? Japanese tactical doctrine had no answer, so soldiers began to do something unprecedented. They stopped attacking Marine positions. February 19, 1945. Aero 900 hours, Iwo Jima. Private Alan Matthews, 19, from Sedalia, Missouri, climbed over the gunwale of his Higgins boat and dropped into the volcanic sand of Red Beach 1. He'd been a farm kid 6 months earlier. Now he was part of the 4th Marine Division assault on the most fortified 8 square miles in the Pacific. The beach seemed quiet, too quiet. Matthews's platoon sergeant, a Guadalcanal veteran named Phillips, kept saying one phrase over and over: "Keep moving, don't bunch up, keep moving." The Japanese weren't firing, not yet. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding the island's defense, had studied every Marine landing for 2 years. He understood Marine doctrine. The first wave expects heavy fire. They're mentally prepared for casualties on the beach. Their training emphasizes rapid movement inland. So Kuribayashi did something revolutionary. He let the first wave land. At Oro 9:17 hours, when 5,000 Marines were packed onto the beaches, he opened fire with every weapon on the island simultaneously. Mortars, artillery, machine guns, all pre-registered on the beach. The volcanic sand, which made digging foxholes impossible, turned each shell burst into a fragmentation grenade, as rocks and shrapnel flew in every direction. Matthews saw Phillips disintegrated by a mortar shell, just gone. One moment giving orders, the next a red mist and pieces. Phillips had a daughter back in South Carolina, 3 years old. He showed everyone her picture, a little girl with pigtails, sitting on a tire swing. Phillips was going to teach her to fish. He'd bought a rod before deployment, shipped it to his wife with instructions. "Keep this safe. This is for Emma and me." Matthews looked at the chaos around him. Marines were dying faster than they could be counted. The statistics would later show that in the first hour on Iwo Jima, the Marine Corps suffered higher casualties than in any single hour of combat in American military history. Every tactical instinct screamed retreat. Get back to the boats. Get into the water. Get away from the killing zone. But Matthews didn't retreat. Nobody retreated, because there's a moment in every Marine's training when the drill instructor asks, "When your buddy is dying and every instinct says run, what do you do?" The answer is always the same. "You attack, sir." Matthews picked up Phillips's rifle and started moving inland. What happened over the next 36 days would cement the Marine Corps' reputation in Japanese military consciousness as something beyond normal soldiers. Iwo Jima had no flanks to turn, no jungle to infiltrate through, no maneuver room, just 8 square miles of volcanic rock, honeycomb with tunnels, defended by 21,000 Japanese soldiers who had sworn to kill 10 Americans each before dying. The Marines took it anyway, yard by yard, bunker by bunker, with flamethrowers and demolition charges and small unit tactics that required junior NCOs to make command-level decisions every 10 minutes. A captured Japanese officer, interrogated after the battle, was asked why his unit had eventually abandoned their fortified positions and attempted a suicidal banzai charge. His answer entered intelligence records. "We could not endure the waiting. The Americans came every day, every hour, with fire, with explosives, with grenades. They never stopped coming. Even when we killed them, more came. We chose to die attacking because dying while waiting was worse." This was the essence of why Japanese soldiers feared Marines more than any other enemy. Not because Marines were better shots or stronger or braver, but because they had internalized a doctrine that made them functionally unkillable. You could shoot a Marine squad to pieces, and the survivors would keep advancing. You could surround a Marine position, and they'd call in artillery on their own coordinates. You could cut off Marine units, and they'd fight for days without resupply. The Japanese had a word for soldiers who wouldn't surrender, even when tactically annihilated: Gyokusai, shattered jewels. It was considered the highest honor in Japanese military culture. The Marines had turned Gyokusai into standard operating procedure. By late 1944, Japanese tactical manuals had been revised to include specific sections on engaging American Marines. The advice was stark. Marines will not retreat when flanked. Marines will not surrender when surrounded. Marines will call fire on their own positions. Avoid direct engagement with Marine units unless numerical superiority exceeds 4-1. When possible, allow Marines to advance past prepared positions, then cut them off from support. Even then, expect prolonged resistance. What the manuals didn't say, what they couldn't say, was that this tactical advice was essentially an admission of psychological defeat. The Japanese military had concluded that Marine units were so dangerous, so unpredictable, so willing to accept casualties, that direct engagement should be avoided. This wasn't the doctrine of a winning force. This was damage mitigation. The most telling evidence came from interrogations of Japanese prisoners. When asked which Allied forces they least wanted to face, 83% said Marines. When asked why, the answers formed a pattern. They don't fight like soldiers, they fight like demons. We could understand British courage, we could understand Australian toughness. Marines don't care if they live. When you kill Marines, more Marines come. When you wound them, they crawl forward, they never stop. One Japanese veteran captured on Okinawa was asked if he'd ever considered surrendering earlier in the war. His answer, surrender to who? The Marines? They don't take prisoners, not because they shoot surrendering men, but because they don't notice when you're trying to surrender. They only see targets. This wasn't true, of course. Marines took thousands of prisoners. But the perception, the psychological reality Japanese soldiers carried into combat was that Marines were something inhuman, something that couldn't be reasoned with or bargained with. The irony is that this reputation was mostly psychological construction. Marine casualties on average weren't dramatically lower than Army infantry casualties. Marine tactical victories weren't always cleaner or faster, but the perception of inevitability, the belief that Marines would eventually take every objective regardless of cost, created a self-fulfilling prophecy. Japanese units facing Marines fought with the desperation of men who believed they were already dead, which meant they made tactical errors, wasted ammunition in panic fire, and broke psychologically faster, which reinforced the Marine reputation, which made the next battle easier, which reinforced the reputation further. Alan Matthews survived Iwo Jima. He returned to Sedalia, married a girl named Dorothy, opened a hardware store on Main Street. He had 3 kids. He never talked about the war. In 1953, a local newspaper reporter, doing a Veterans Day story, discovered Matthews had received the Navy Cross for action on Iwo Jima. The reporter asked what he did to earn it. Matthews said, "I kept moving forward." That was all. No details, no heroics. Just the core of Marine doctrine, reduced to 4 words. Mitchell Page received the Medal of Honor for his action on Guadalcanal. After the war, he worked as a salesman for the Bendix Corporation, selling industrial equipment. His business card didn't mention the medal. When customers learned about it, Page would change the subject. "Just did what any Marine would do," he'd say. But what any Marine would do was exactly what made them feared. The Japanese military had built its entire tactical doctrine on the assumption that soldiers, even brave, well-trained soldiers, had limits: pain tolerance, casualty acceptance, unit cohesion under stress. The Marines had systematically eliminated those limits through training, culture, and doctrine. Not completely. They were still human, but enough that the normal calculations of combat no longer applied. A Japanese staff officer, in his post-war memoir, wrote, "We spent 5 years learning to defeat British colonial forces. We spent 3 years learning to defeat Chinese resistance. We never learned to defeat the Marines because there was nothing to learn." You cannot develop tactics against an enemy whose doctrine is simply to never stop. The famous image of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima, became an iconic symbol of American resolve. But for Japanese veterans, that image represented something different. Proof that the Marines had taken an island the Imperial Japanese Army had declared impossible to capture. The flag wasn't just a symbol of victory. It was proof that Marine doctrine, the willingness to accept any cost, endure any hardship, persist through any obstacle, worked. After the war, Marine Corps Commandant General Alexander Vandergrift was asked what made Marines different from other soldiers. His answer was simple. Marines have been taught that there is no such thing as being surrounded. We call it a target-rich environment. That sentence, that mindset, is why Japanese soldiers feared Marines more than any other enemy. Not because Marines were superhuman, but because they'd been taught to reframe every tactical disadvantage as an opportunity, every desperate situation as just another problem to solve, every battle as winnable if you were willing to pay the price. The Japanese called it irrational. They called it suicidal. They called it marine disease. The Marines called it semper fidelis, always faithful, to the mission, to each other, to the idea that retreat is not in the vocabulary, surrender is not an option, and the only acceptable outcome is victory or death trying. That's why Japanese intelligence reports found in archives after the war contained a chilling pattern. When describing American forces, they used clinical military language. Army division observed at coordinates, Navy task force approaching sector, Air Force bombing campaign assessed. When describing Marines, the language changed. Marine presence confirmed in sector. Recommend avoiding direct engagement. In the calculus of war, the side that makes the enemy change their tactics to avoid you has already won. The fight becomes not about defeating the enemy, but about making them fear engaging at all. By 1945, the Japanese military had developed elaborate tactics for avoiding Marine units. Pull back from beach defenses, hide in tunnels, wait for army forces, anything to delay the inevitable encounter with men who'd been trained to see death as just another tactical obstacle. That fear, that psychological dominance, is why the Marine Corps, despite being the smallest of America's military services, received some of the most difficult assignments in the Pacific War. Not because they had better equipment or more men, but because commanders knew Marines would take the objective. It might cost 50% casualties, it might take weeks, but they'd take it. General Holland Smith, commander of Marine forces in the Pacific, said it plainly. The Marines don't know how to spell defeat. That sentence isn't about spelling, it's about a psychological truth. If you can make yourself believe defeat is impossible, truly believe it down to your bones, then you become nearly impossible to defeat. Because you'll try things sensible soldiers won't. You'll persist when prudent soldiers would withdraw. You'll attack when reasonable soldiers would defend. And eventually the enemy starts making decisions based on what you might do, rather than what they want to do. That's when you've won the psychological war that underlies all military conflict. The Japanese learned this too late. By the time they'd revised their tactics to account for Marine doctrine, they'd already lost the initiative, lost the strategic positions, lost the psychological edge that had carried them through 5 years of conquest. A Japanese naval officer, writing after the war, perhaps summed it up best. We could have defeated the American Army. We could have endured the American Navy. We could have survived the American Air Force, but we could not outlast the American Marines. They were too few to conquer us, but too determined to be conquered. In the end, they simply wore down our will to resist. That's the truth behind why Japanese soldiers feared Marines more than any other enemy. Not because Marines were invincible, but because they'd been trained to act as if they were, to fight as if defeat wasn't possible, to persist as if time and casualties meant nothing compared to mission accomplishment. That mindset, multiplied across thousands of young men from farms and small towns across America, transformed into something that looked like superpowers to an enemy who'd never encountered it before. If this story moved you, hit that like button. These men didn't fight for glory or recognition. Most of them never told their families what they'd done. They fought because they believed in something bigger than themselves. The least we can do is remember them. Subscribe to this channel to keep these forgotten stories alive, and drop a comment below. Did anyone in your family serve in the Pacific? Have you heard similar stories from veterans? We read every comment, and your stories matter. Thank you for taking the time to remember these men. Their courage bought the world we live in today. The least we can do is not forget. Semper Fi. Final statistics. Marine Corps casualties in Pacific War: 86, 940, 19, 733 killed. Japanese soldiers who surrendered to Marines, entire war. Approximately 800 Japanese soldiers who surrendered to Army forces, Okinawa alone. Approximately 400 average time for Marines to secure beach landing versus Army Marines 4 2 hours, Army 9 7 hours. Japanese avoid engagement recommendations in intelligence reports mentioning Marines, 127 documented cases, post-war Japanese veterans citing Marines as most feared enemy, 83%, 1950 survey of 2 Liu Zuruzurun POWs. Mitchell Page died in 2003, age 85. His obituary in the Los Angeles Times was 6 paragraphs long. It mentioned the Medal of Honor in paragraph 4. Most of Sedalia, Missouri never knew he was a hero. That's how he wanted it. Alan Matthews died in 1989, age 63. His Navy Cross hangs in the Sedalia Public Library, donated anonymously. The plaque doesn't mention his name. It says only, for a Marine who kept moving forward. There's a small museum in Quantico, Virginia, that houses Marine Corps history. In one corner behind glass sits a Browning M1917 machine gun. The barrel is warped from heat. The stock has bloodstains. A small card reads, "Recovered from Guadalcanal, 1942. User unknown. Fired approximately 10 Suozaran rounds in sustained combat." That gun might have been Page's. Or it might have belonged to one of the hundreds of other Marines who did exactly what he did. Picked up a weapon too heavy to carry, and carried it anyway, into fights that couldn't be won and won them anyway, against enemies who couldn't be beaten and beat them anyway. Because that's what Marines do, they keep moving forward.